last we saw Joseph, he was out of prison. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams. God gave him not just the interpretation, but he also gave him wisdom on what to do with it. Isn't that a wonderful thing about God? He calls us to things to do that we can't do on our own, but he gives us the ability to do them because we rest in him and who he is. Remember, Joseph said this, interpretations belong to God. This wasn't Joseph had some sort of ability in and of himself. He knew that everything he did came from God. And this suggestion pleased Pharaoh and his servants. Pharaoh understood that God gave Joseph wisdom. Isn't that a fascinating thing? Pharaoh, the pagan, the polytheist, knew that Joseph's God had given him something special. Because none of the magicians, none of the dream interpreters, the wise men could interpret the dream. But Joseph could. There was something special in him. Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? That's the English, and we understand that Pharaoh, without knowing it, is referring to Joseph's God. Joseph is a monotheist. Pharaoh was a pagan polytheist. He believed in many gods. And so really a better interpretation is, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit or are the spirits of the gods? See, when we read the Old Testament, the word Elohim is plural. And when it refers to pagan gods, it is plural, the gods. And usually the words describing that, the modifying words, are also plural. So, the gods did this, plural. The gods did that, plural. The gods, they said this. But when it refers to Yahweh, when it refers to the one true God, it's also plural, Elohim, but the modifying words are singular. So, the gods he said, the gods he did, rather than the gods they said or they did. Just a little bit of information for you. Because of Joseph's God-given wisdom and discernment, Pharaoh immediately placed Joseph as second in command of all of Egypt. He was in charge of everything and everyone except for Pharaoh. Think about this. Right? We have talked about, and as the election comes up, we'll talk about it a lot more. God raises up leaders and he tears them down. He is the one who puts people in office. He is the one who puts people on the throne. And we see this very thing happen here. Joseph, the favored son, turned slave, turned prisoner, is now presiding over the most powerful nation in the world. In one day, he went from prisoner to second only to Pharaoh. Nobody could have written this. There is no Disney fantasy story that is as good as this. God raised Joseph up and he put him in charge. He is now the prime minister of Egypt. It is God who exalted Joseph in his time and in his way. See, God is never up in heaven, whatever that means, wondering, who's going to do my work? If only I could find somebody who would do this for me, then we could be okay. No, God always raises people up. He is not concerned about how his work will get done or who will proclaim his name. Our only job is to do it. He will always raise up people to do what he wants. We just need to be ready and faithful to what he has called us to do and be who he has called us to be. And that was Joseph. So Pharaoh gave Joseph his signet ring. This is the symbol of his power. This is how Joseph could sign documents with Pharaoh's name. He had the power. He had the authority. He dressed Joseph in royal clothes. Isn't that interesting? I wonder what Joseph thought about when he was putting those clothes on. The special clothes Joseph's life had been in turmoil, partly because of the special clothes that his father gave him. But his clothing, once again, plays a role in his status. Pharaoh's second chariot was given to Joseph. This is like Air Force Two, right? Where Air Force One is the president's, Air Force Two is the vice president's. The only difference is in our country, John Adams said that the vice president is the most worthless position there is. In that world, Joseph had power. He had actual authority over everybody and everything. So he's in this chariot. The horse-drawn chariot had not been invented yet. And so this was a chariot carried by men. So Joseph is carried around by men, and people went before him, commanding people to bow the knee to Joseph. In his dream, his brothers would bow down before him. But here, the entire nation of Egypt bowed before Joseph. Prisoner one day, the very next day, people were forced by Pharaoh to bow down to Joseph. Do you ever wonder what goes through people's head as you read the Bible? Like, what was Joseph? His mind had to have been absolutely blown. Like pinching himself. What is happening? Where am I? Knowing that God had done this. Notice verse 44. I am Pharaoh. This is not Pharaoh introducing himself to Joseph. Right? This is not Pharaoh saying, hey, just so you know, I'm Pharaoh. This is Pharaoh making a divine declaration. The Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was a god. The Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was eternal and worthy of worship, and he was omnipotent and omniscient. The Egyptians believed that Pharaoh was a god. And so this proclamation is like we read in the Old Testament, thus says the Lord. Pharaoh is making what he believes, or what the Egyptians believe, to be a divine decree. Now let's pause for a moment and reflect on this, because it's fascinating. Pharaoh was given dreams neither he nor any of his wise men could interpret. So much for his omniscience. If he was truly omniscient, this wouldn't be an issue. Here, Pharaoh was helpless, and he was without wisdom and understanding until this foreigner and his God came and interpreted for him. See, without Joseph and his God, Egypt, as we know it, would have collapsed and would not have existed. We wouldn't have the pyramids. We wouldn't have all those things because they came after Joseph, and Egypt would have collapsed as many nations did because of famine. God continues to set himself up against the so-called gods of Egypt. In his declaration, Pharaoh made sure that Joseph was exalted. He gave him an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. There's some debate as to what this means, but it most likely means the God speaks and he lives, or God has spoken and he shall live. The focus is on the God of Joseph preserving the Egyptians. Pharaoh knows that it is Joseph's God who did this. The gods of Egypt did not. Remember, as we talked about Old Testament cultures, different cultures had different gods, and when they were set up against each other, it was believed that the more powerful God would win. And so in Pharaoh's mind, he has his gods, and Joseph has his God. Pharaoh's gods were not able to interpret the dream, but Joseph's God was. And so through his God, the God of Joseph speaks, and we live. Joseph was given an Egyptian wife, Asenath. Now, it's important to note that this was not Joseph's choice. This was Pharaoh's command. Why is that important? Because we've seen before how the Israelites were not to marry foreigners. And here Joseph did. She was a daughter of a priest she was named for an Egyptian goddess. Her father, Pharaoh, was the priest of the city of On, which in Greek is later called Heliopolis. It's about 7 miles northeast of Cairo. His name means him who Ra gave. The city was important. It was a city of seers, a city of dream interpreters, a city of priests. And so Joseph married into a high religious caste in Egypt. He was exalted not only because of his position, but because of the status of his wife. Joseph was truly exalted in Egypt. And so what did Joseph do? He went over all the land of Egypt. He didn't sit idly. He went right to work. Remember, he told Pharaoh, this is coming soon. We got to get started on this. And so Joseph went throughout the land. He's working to develop and build storage houses of grain as the grain would start coming in. It's fascinating. Many of these storehouses that were made for grain are still in Egypt today. He was 30 years old when he entered into Pharaoh's service. It was 13 years since he was sold into slavery. It would be another 9-ish years before he saw his brothers. So Joseph oversaw the collection and the storing of grain during the years of plenty. The grain was not in one location. It was all over the nation. It was everywhere. They had different storehouses built throughout the nation. And there was so much abundance that it couldn't be measured. God told them that there was going to be years of plenty. They started measuring it as it came in, and then it got too much. Remember, the tax was 20%. It was a 20% tax on the grain. There was so much of the 20% that it couldn't be measured. During the years of abundance, Joseph had 2 sons. If we remember Hebrew culture, the mother named the children, but here Joseph named his sons. The firstborn, Manasseh. God has made me to forget all my hardship and all my father's house. This does not mean that Joseph forgot who he was. It does not mean that Joseph forgot his roots. It means that he had worked through what had happened to him and he was able to move on. He was able to live day to day. Second son, Ephraim. Joseph said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Joseph was in Egypt. He was successful. He was in a position of power, and yet Egypt was not his home. This was the land of his affliction. See, we see here in Joseph's life how we're supposed to live here on earth. This is not our home. This is the land of affliction. We are foreigners here. Our home, our eternal home, is with Jesus, is the new heaven and the new earth, and we are foreigners here. This is the land of our affliction. But as Joseph was faithful in the way that he lived, so we are to be faithful in the lives that we live. See, our call is to be faithful wherever we are, because it's the Lord who put us here. And He has a purpose for us, and that purpose is His purpose, not our own. This is why we have to read and understand His Word. This is why we need to pray. This is why we need to listen to what God has called us to do, because we have a purpose, and that purpose is what He intends for us. But in both of his sons' names, we see that Joseph remembered the Lord, and he knew that he was not an Egyptian. This was not his home. And yet he was faithful. The 7 years of plenty came to an end. Joseph was now 37 years old. He had been in Egypt for 20 years. He was in Egypt now longer than he was in Canaan. He was now not just in charge of collecting the food, but he was in charge of how the food was to be dispersed, how it was to be sold. Nobody could buy grain apart from Joseph's oversight. Notice also that the famine was not limited only to Egypt. It was all over the earth, at least in Canaan and the Middle East. We know that because we see Joseph's family later come down. But we also see ancient records of massive famine that was in the area around that time. Everything was now in place for Joseph to meet his brothers. The 20 years that he had been there, God was setting the stage for something that was going to happen. But notice also that from verses 53 to 57, the word famine is used 6 times. And this is done to show the severity of the famine. See, in Hebrew, and similar to Greek, as the Bible is written in those languages, when words are used multiple times in a short period, it is meant to magnify that word. It is meant to show the importance of that word. And famine is used 6 times in those verses to show that its severity, it is really bad. There's an Egyptian stela, which is a rock with writing on it, that describes the famine. If you notice, I don't know if it's clear, but you can see the ribs in these guys to show the severity of the famine. Here's what it says. It tells of Egypt's history, of how Pharaoh Dozier had a dream. And Imhotep, a commoner, revealed to him the meaning of his dream, and he saved Egypt from a terrible 7-year famine and became the second most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh Dozier. Sounds very similar, doesn't it? Now, there's a lot of debate on whether or not this refers to what the Bible has to say, because many archaeologists don't, especially in the Middle East, don't want the Bible to be proven true. But if it's not the same story, there's a significant parallel that happened. As we close out this section, I want to talk about some things from Genesis. See, when we started, we talked about Genesis, the 3:15 Redeemer, and how the Redeemer would crush the head of the serpent, that he would undo the curse of the garden, the curse of sin. Remember the promise, the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head, and we have seen this struggle throughout Genesis. Cain killed Abel. Ishmael hated Isaac. Esau hated and wanted to kill Jacob. The seed of the serpent is always opposed to the seed of the woman. We've seen in other things. In the flood, we saw that God would judge sin, but that he would provide a way for redemption, one way, his way. In Sodom and Gomorrah, we saw that God would judge sin, but would not punish the righteous with the unrighteous. In Melchizedek, we saw the king of peace and the king of righteousness, who is also a priest of the Most High God, something that the Mosaic law didn't allow for a priest to be a king, but we saw those together in Melchizedek. In the birth of Isaac, we saw how the promised seed would be born miraculously, God's way, not man's way. In the Abrahamic covenant, we saw that the promised seed would be a blessing to all nations, but he would be descended from Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob. See, it's easy to read the Bible. It's easy to read the events of Joseph's life and see that, or teach that if we just do these things, then God is faithful and he will reward us. But see, we get a behind-the-scenes glimpse of what's going on here. It wasn't Pharaoh that exalted Joseph, it was God. God placed Joseph in the place that he was and raised him up at the right time. It was God who gave Pharaoh the dreams and prevented the Egyptians from understanding the dreams. It was God who gave Joseph the interpretations. Pharaoh exalted Joseph out of necessity, a necessity that God created. Let this be a lesson to us all. God is in control of all situations, even the ones we don't understand, even the ones that we don't like. He has placed you where you are for a reason. And again, this doesn't mean that we understand everything or like everything, but because He does, it provides comfort. Because He is sovereign, it provides us comfort. See, what often happens, again, when we study Joseph, or really the Old Testament in general, it's kind of a moral therapeutic deism. It's a do-to-be idea. If you do these things, then God will do this. If you are faithful, then God will exalt you to the second most powerful person in the world, or whatever it is. People look at Joseph and see his faithfulness and then say something like, as Joseph was rewarded by God for being faithful, so you will be rewarded by God if you are faithful. See, we know that we are not promised earthly blessings if we are obedient. Jesus was very clear on that. But when we teach the Bible like that, when we think about the so-called prosperity gospel, which is really no gospel at all, if we're not rewarded in this life, if we're not given riches or power, then we teach people that the Bible cannot be trusted. If we teach things that the Bible doesn't say, and they don't happen, then it brings into question everything that the Bible says, which is why we need to be very faithful when we teach the Bible, when we read His Word. We need to be careful who we listen to, because it can fill our mind with things that are not true. Yes, Joseph was faithful, and so should we. We should be faithful as well. But the focus of this is not on Joseph's faithfulness, it's on God's faithfulness in accomplishing His purposes. Remember also that Jesus said the entire Old Testament was about Him. And so let's look briefly about how this section of Joseph points us to the 315 Redeemer. The very high view, the seed of Abraham, Joseph, was exalted to the right hand of power. He had been faithful and been made fruitful in the land of his affliction. And through him, he brought a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Seeing Jesus in this way is very obvious. But let's look closer because it's even more striking. Joseph was the shepherd's son beloved by his father. Shepherd's son beloved by his father. Jesus is the good shepherd beloved by his father. Joseph was rejected by his brothers. Jesus was rejected by his own people and his brothers. Joseph was sold for silver. Jesus was sold for silver. Joseph was wrongfully condemned as a criminal. Jesus was wrongfully condemned as a criminal. There were two other criminals with Joseph in his punishment. There were two others crucified with Jesus in his punishment. One criminal with Joseph was condemned. The other one was restored to life. There was one criminal with Jesus that was condemned, and the other was restored to eternal life. Joseph was sent ahead to prepare a place for his brothers. Jesus was sent ahead to prepare a place for us. See, the Old Testament gives us glimpses of the 315 Redeemer and who he would be. These are types that would reveal aspects of who he would be and what he would do. But Joseph was not the 315 Redeemer, which is why we don't look to him. He does not provide salvation, but he points to the one who does. See, God, as we see in Joseph, God protects his people, and he uses his people. He uses us for his purpose and his glory. See, protection doesn't mean Skittles and rainbows. It doesn't mean that all is good and everybody will be happy, healthy, and whatever. Protection is eternal protection. He will save us eternally. So we don't look to Joseph to be like Joseph. This is not what the Bible tells us to do. The Bible tells us in Romans 12 to keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Hebrews 11 is the people of great faith, that they lived their lives for God. They've obeyed. They did what He called them to do. And the Bible says, because we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, don't look to them. Look to Jesus. Look to the one that they pointed us to. Look to the one. Have hope in the one that they hoped in. So remember that in everything, the Bible is about Jesus. My prayer is that as we have gone through and as we continue to go through Genesis, you will learn to see, you will learn how to read the Bible. That you will learn how to see Jesus, that you read it in such a way that you don't see yourself as the main character, but you see Jesus as the main character. You see how the Bible points us to Him. There's many different times, many different ways that this is done. You've probably heard of the story of David and Goliath, and as David slayed his giants, so you need to slay your giants. You are not David. You are the weak Israelites who are scared and can't do anything. And God sends His Redeemer in to defeat your enemy for you. He is the hero of the story. He is the hero of the Bible. And as we go through Genesis, we don't look to Joseph that we one day hope that we will be exalted as Joseph was. We read Joseph and see that God is faithful in who He is, and His purposes will always happen. When you can read the Bible like this, you will start to know Him more. And just like every other relationship in your life, the more you know Him, the more you will love Him, the more you will trust Him. And by doing this, you will be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And as this world continues to be dark, you have that glimpse of hope. You know that He is all that you need because He is all that you have. We don't understand what's happening in the world. Look around. Does any of this make sense to you? No. But who does it make sense to? The one who knows what He's doing, and He's doing it for a purpose. And as we live and as we read our Bible and know Him more, we trust Him. And we know that He is sovereign, that no matter what happens, we can have the peace that passes understanding that only He can give. And that peace comes through only Jesus the Christ, who conquered sin and death and is now at the right hand of the Father.